Presents responsible cuts, broad bipartisan agreement. I say let's cut some spending, and let's cut it now, and let's cut it today. Take yes for an answer. Don't snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. This is the right thing to do, and the American people will appreciate it. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Washington.
I yield 4 minutes to the distinguished Democratic whip, Mr. Hoyer from Maryland.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 4 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. And I'm not sure whether I rise for or against this, very frankly, because I think this process is not the process that we ought to be pursuing. I think in that context I speak for the chairman and for the ranking member and for most members in this body. But I wanted to, I was going to wait a while, but then I heard Mr. Dent of Pennsylvania speak, and I want to reiterate this point that he made, because I made it last week in my colloquy with the majority leader. And I made the point that we're about to make the largest single reduction in discretionary spending that we have made. The gentleman said in history. I was more modest and said in the 30 years that I've been here. But in any event, this is not an insubstantial cut. The problem those of us have on this side of the aisle is it is not enough for a large number of your folks. And they have said so. And the Heritage Foundation has said so. And the Family Research Council has said so. And some of your members have said so. Now, the fact of the matter is, this is a lousy way to run a railroad. We are trying to run the largest enterprise in the world in 2-week segments. It is costly to the private sector. It is extraordinarily inefficient for the public sector, and it is demoralizing for the private sector who deals with the government and for the public employees we've asked to perform the services that we have set forth as policy. And so I say, at this juncture, this ought to be the last of this type. We need to reach agreement. Now, I say to my friend from Pennsylvania, because it is the largest cut, we think we've come a long way. You said you wanted to cut $100 billion. Now you're not cutting the $41 billion that we cut. You were using the 2011 baseline. That's how you got your $100 billion. $41 billion, we've all agreed, is gone. We're going to freeze at 2010 and go below that. So we've come $41 billion away, and we agree on that. Now, you used the 2011. That wasn't our figure first. You used it in September. We used it in December. So my view is we've agreed on $41 billion. Now, you don't say that. You say, well, we're between 0 and 60. I understand your rationale, but it's your figure, it's your baseline that you used in September in your pledge to America. If we've gone 41 and we're now going to go another 10 or 15, what I ask of you is, in light of the fact, as Mr. Dent points out, we've already done the deepest cut under Republicans, under Democrats, under any of us. It is time to hear from you what is your alternative to make a deal. Now, compromise is a prettier word, but we need to come to agreement. If we're going to serve our country and those who serve our country, then we need to come to agreement because they elected all of us. None of us has any greater superiority. We're all the same. And we need to come to agreement. I don't have much time, but I'll be glad to yield to you. Can you take some time to...
Would the gentleman talk to his colleagues over in the other body and tell them to pass something we can begin to negotiate on?
Regaining my time, 435 of us have tried to talk to the people in the other body. But I will tell you, under the Constitution of the United States, we have the responsibility of initiating bills. Read the Constitution. Read the Constitution. We sent H.R. 1 over there, as my good friend, the former Speaker of Idaho, says to me, and they didn't pass it. It's not their responsibility to initiate. That didn't go anyplace. May I have one additional minute?
Gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Rogers, may I have one additional minute?
Gentleman from Washington controls the time.
I don't
30 seconds.
30 seconds.
Additional 30 seconds.
I will say to you, we can wring our hands and say, well, the Senate's not doing its job. We're not in the Senate. We're here. Let us come to agreement. And we know the agreement is going to be someplace in between where you are and where we are. We know that. But what we don't know is what you can pass. What you don't know is what you can pass. You don't know what your caucus will do. I understand that. You're deeply divided, in my opinion. And we need to know, because it's not just us here that are adversely affected. Let us come to agreement. Let us stop this process of funding government in very short cycles. It is not good for our country. It's not good for the people who work for our country, and it's not good for the people who are doing work around the world. I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Speaker.
For what purposes, gentleman from Washington?
Could you tell the chairman and myself what our time remaining is?
Gentleman from Washington has 12 3/4 minutes remaining. Gentleman from Kentucky has 16 minutes remaining. Gentleman from Kentucky.
Mr. Speaker, of which I yield 3 minutes to the distinguished chairman of the Interior Subcommittee on Appropriation, Mr. Simpson.
I thank the gentleman for
yielding.
Gentleman
from Idaho is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the Speaker. I can tell the gentleman that just spoke, the minority whip, a good friend of mine, what we can pass in this House and what our conference will agree to, and that's the $61 million in cuts or $100 million overall that we've already agreed to and already passed. We can pass that in this House. Now, I've heard that this is no way to run a railroad. My good friend from Virginia said this is no way to run a government. I've heard this is operational outrage. I will tell you the outrage here is that we are having to do this because the majority, the former majority, when they had the majority in the House, the majority in the Senate, and the White House, failed to pass an appropriation bill. They left the American people in this country with this pile of crap. They should not complain about how we try to clean this up. Mr. Speaker, by the end of this week, the Appropriations Subcommittee, which I'm privileged to chair, the Interior and Environment Subcommittee, will have had 12 budget oversight hearings over the past 3 weeks. That's 12 hearings addressing the fiscal 012 budget that we will soon be writing. It's worth noting that we are now 5.5 months into the fiscal year 2011, and we still don't have a budget to fund the government through the end of the current fiscal year. The CR we're considering today keeps the government operating for another 3 weeks. And you're right, we need to solve this within this next 3 weeks. The problem is you cannot negotiate with a body across the rotunda that fails to act. We can't be the only ones at the table. We have to have something to negotiate with. We don't have that. This CR saves taxpayers $6 billion, including $650 million in spending cuts from the Interior Subcommittee accounts that Republicans, Democrats, and the administration agree are reasonable and supportable on a bipartisan basis. The overall savings achieved through this CR at a rate of $2 billion per week is the 3-week equivalent to the $100 billion in cuts achieved in the long-term CR passed by the House Republicans several weeks ago. In the Interior budget alone, we've cut $380 million out of earmarks. We've cut the National Park Service Preserve America program, eliminated it, and other programs, Save America's Treasures in the National Park Service, programs that the administration did not request funding for in their 012 budget. So these are things that are agreed on by both Republicans and Democrats. Now that the Senate has voted down 2 versions of the year-long CR, the Republican version known as H.R. 1, that cuts spending by $100 billion and the Democratic version that cuts substantially less, it's time for both sides to come together on a funding bill for the rest of this year. The truth is that we really need to get the fiscal year 2011 budget written, passed, and signed into law so we can turn our attention to next year's budget. In the midst of the back and forth debate on spending, it's important to remember that these funding bills don't write themselves. Our Appropriations Committee staff have been working day and night, 7 days a week, for months now, writing one CR after another, even as they prepare for hearings and study budget proposals for next year. I encourage my colleagues to support this CR to keep the government open while both parties work to identify an acceptable level of spending cuts for the rest of the year. We can and should cut more from the spending budget, and I encourage my colleagues to support this CR.
Gentleman from Washington.
I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished lady from Hawaii, Mazie Hirono, who is going to correct the record on the NOAA issue.
Gentlewoman from Hawaii is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. First of all, the cuts to NOAA and our weather services are contained in H.R. 1, and we have not reached agreement on H.R. 1, which is why we're doing yet another CR. And believe me, those kinds of cuts to NOAA and our weather services will have an impact on our ability to implement early warning systems. Some of you may not know that Hawaii has already suffered millions and millions of dollars of damages as a result of the tsunami, and yes, it does not compare at all to the tragedy that the Japanese people are facing, but nonetheless, thank goodness, our early warning systems were in place. Now, as to this CR, I rise in opposition to this CR, which continues the Republican strategy of cutting $2 billion every week from programs that support jobs and our families. I want to focus on just one program being cut out of many, by the way, that affects real people in real ways. That is particularly troubling to me in this CR. This is the elimination of all funding for the Watershed and Flood Prevention Operations Program, popularly known as PL 566. This $30 million program means a lot to small rural communities nationwide. For Hawaii, the decline of sugar and pineapple industries has forced us to transition from large-scale plantation agriculture to small-scale farming. PL 566 has been the only federal program that has really worked to deal with our agricultural water issues, and it is the single most important federal agricultural program for Hawaii. Hawaii is the most food import-dependent state in the entire country. So agricultural self-sufficiency is a priority for us, which is one reason why continued funding for Hawaii's PL 566 projects is so critical. In addition, PL 566 provides flood prevention for small communities that the Army Corps does not serve. Hawaii projects include the Lower Hamakua Ditch watershed projects to rehabilitate a 26-mile-long irrigation ditch that provides water to hundreds of small farmers on Hawaii Island. May I have another 30 seconds?
I yield the lady another 30 seconds.
Upcountry Maui Watershed Project providing water to 170 farmers and ranchers on Maui. The Wailuku Alainaʻi Watershed and Lahaina Watershed projects that prevent flooding on Hawaii and Maui. So these long-term projects help to build our local economies and create jobs. And stopping these projects in midstream is irresponsible, unsafe. It makes no economic sense at all. So most of these projects are well on their way. We need to continue funding these programs to support our communities, support jobs. And this program has long had bipartisan support. In fact, last year I signed a joint letter led by Ag Committee Chair Lucas urging funding for this program.
Thank
you.
Good. In going back and looking, NOAA Operations, Research, and Facilities in H.R. 1 is cut by $454.3 billion. And one of the officials there said what would happen if the continuing resolution, there will be a dismantling of our nation's early warning system. Dan Sobian, president of the National Weather Service Employees Organization, said in a telephone interview it would result in a roughly 30% cut in the budget of the National Weather Service. Sobian said the current plans call for the Weather Service to close individual offices for about a month at a time on a rolling basis.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Kentucky.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the distinguished chairman of the Legislative Branch Appropriations Subcommittee, Mr. Crenshaw, Florida.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 3 minutes.
Well, I thank the chairman for yielding, and Mr. Speaker, I rise to encourage my colleagues to vote in favor of this continuing resolution for 2 reasons. Number one, it keeps us on the path to put the brakes on this runaway spending that's gone around this place too long. It continues us to get to a place where we start a culture of savings instead of this culture of spending. And the second reason to vote for this, of course, is to make sure that we don't shut down the government, to give us a little more time to try to negotiate the spending levels for next year. Now, somebody asked the question, is this the best way to fund the government? Of course it's not. There's no way. It would have been a whole lot better if last year, under the Democratic leadership in this House, we had a budget before this House that would pass. But that didn't happen. It would have been better last year during the session if the Democratic leadership had gone through regular order. We'd passed the appropriations bill, and then the government would be funded for 2011. But they didn't do that. And it would have been a whole lot better after this House got together, made some tough choices, set some priorities, made difficult decisions, and passed a spending bill that cut $100 billion out of this year's spending and sent it down to the Senate. It would have been better if they had taken that up and passed it, or at least done something. But they didn't do that. So here we are. We find ourselves another CR, 3 more weeks. But let me tell you, these are difficult times. And in difficult times, leaders have to lead. We've got to sit down together and establish the priorities we have for spending. We've got to make tough choices. That's what every American family does. That's what every American business does. If we're going to get this economy moving again, we need to settle this once and for all. So I just hope that we'll pass this continuing resolution, that this will indeed be the last time we do this. 3 weeks, sit down, have that other body sit down and negotiate with us. It takes 2 to tango, as they say. We sent the whole ball of wax down there, and they didn't like it. So now we're sending them a little at a time, but we're honoring that pledge to cut $100 billion. When you cut $2 billion every week, that all adds up to $100 billion. So this is $6 more billion that we're cutting on top of the $4 billion we're cutting. But again, that's no way to settle the year. But let's settle it once for all. Let's pass this, move ahead, and get this thing done. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Washington.
I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished lady from Ohio, Marcy Kaptur, who is a very senior member of the Appropriations Committee, and I think the longest-serving woman in the House of Representatives.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank my dear colleague for his great leadership and for yielding me this time. Let me just say that I urge my colleagues to vote no on this continuing resolution. It cuts money for jobs to people that give social services to our senior citizens at a time when gas prices are going up and food prices are going up. Jobs to clean up our brownfield sites across this country. And if you don't know what those are, you're lucky. Jobs that affect our public broadcasting, the only decent broadcasting left in this country with the garbage that's on the airwaves today, and jobs dealing with construction and repair of our Save America's Treasures program, some of the oldest buildings in America that our children and grandchildren have a right to enjoy as we have. So people say, where are you going to get the money? Let me tell you where the money is and what's not on the table in trying to balance the federal budget. How about the profits of the Wall Street Big Six? Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Morgan Stanley, Citigroup, they took just last year $51 billion in profits, $51 billion at the expense of the American people in this great recession that we're enduring. They're happy as clams. Their top executives alone took $26 million, not counting all their stock options. We didn't touch a penny of their bonuses. Ooh, can't do that. They're paying at an 11% tax rate when businesses in my district have to pay at 35%. What's fair about that? We could have $13, $14, $15, $16 billion if they just paid at the same rate just for last year. And oil prices, the American people are being gouged all across this country. Exxon made $9 billion in the third quarter of last year. Guess how much they paid in taxes? A big goose egg. Zero. Zero. And British Petroleum, $5 billion in 1 quarter. How much did they pay? Where's that on the table? So we say to the American people, you can't balance a $1 trillion deficit on 14% of the budget. What you're doing, you're hurting the American people. Let's take it from those who have much and give nothing. I yield back my remaining time.
Yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky.
Yield 3 minutes, Mr. Speaker, to a very hard-working member of our committee. Gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole.
Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise to urge the adoption of HJR 48 for the continuing appropriations for this fiscal year. It seems to me that we've got three questions we ought to address in the course of this debate. First, and very elementally, why are we here? Second, what does the bill do? And third, what are the consequences if the bill isn't passed? We're here for the simple reason that the last Congress, with my good friends on the other side ran, never passed the budget, never passed a single appropriations bill. We're here because the Democratic majority failed to do its work. We're also here because the current Democratic majority in the other body has so far failed to do its work. I remind my colleagues we actually passed legislation, sent it over. I also remind my colleagues that the one proposal in front of the Senate that got the most votes was actually the Republican H.R. 1. But nevertheless, they failed to give us something to negotiate against. It's their obligation in the Senate at some point to have a common negotiating position. I don't know how we can sit down and negotiate otherwise. So we're here, I think, because of a Democratic failure both in the last Congress and this one. Second, what's this bill do? Well, it's pretty commonsensical. It cuts and reduces 25 programs, saving $3.5 billion. Most of those programs, the President and the majority say they don't want to continue. It eliminates $2.6 billion in earmarks, and by itself is one of the largest cuts any CR has ever administered. And as has been pointed out earlier, if you combine it with the previous CR, is a very substantial cut indeed. It buys time, but it also keeps the government running, and it keeps us on course to reduce spending at $2 billion a week, something that my colleagues and I are committed. Finally, what happens if we don't pass this bill? I know there's some that want to spend more, some that want to spend less. The first thing that happens is we shut down the government, something all of us know is not a wise thing to do. The second thing that happens is that we probably create financial panic in the country and harm a fragile economy. And finally, the last thing that happens, and I think actually the most important, is we raise fundamental doubts amongst the American people as to whether or not this institution and we as elected officials have the capacity to actually address and solve our problems. So I think we need to pass this bill. We need to give our friends on the other side of the aisle, particularly in the Senate, another 3 weeks to see if they can possibly come up with a negotiating position. And I'm confident once those negotiations begin that our Speaker will keep the government running, will bargain in good faith, but will cut spending as we're committed to do. And with that, I yield back my time, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Washington.
I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I also want to take a moment to congratulate and thank two longtime committee staff members who both are leaving us this month after many years of service. Beverly Fato spent 10 years on the committee, serving as clerk on both the Transportation Subcommittee and the Homeland Security Subcommittee before becoming the first woman staff director of the full committee under former Chairman David Obey. Bev was the top Democratic staff person during 9/11, the creation of the Transportation Security Administration and the Department of Homeland Security, and during Hurricane Katrina. And in the last Congress, as Majority Clerk, Beverly helped craft the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the Recovery Act that saved tens of thousands of American jobs and kept this country from slipping into another Great Depression. We thank Bev for agreeing to stay on with us and help with the committee's transition and congratulate her on her many years of service, both in the executive branch as well as for us. She will be missed, but we will wish her well in her new endeavors. I also want to extend my deep appreciation to Chris Topic, who has served on the Interior Appropriations Subcommittee since 1995, most recently as the Minority Clerk. Chris began his career with the U.S. Forest Service before coming to the committee as a detail lead. During his time on the Interior Subcommittee, Chris found himself in the middle of some of the most contentious environmental policy disputes, but always remained the consummate professional. While I chaired the Interior Subcommittee, I relied heavily on his solid judgment and wise counsel. I wish Chris the very best as he leaves the committee and thank him again for his service. And I retain the balance of my time.
Yield. Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, I yield. I yield to the distinguished chairman.
Let me join on behalf of us on this side in thanking those two wonderful individuals for dedicated public service. They have worked hard on behalf of the public, and they deserve our utmost thanks, which I offer at this time. Thanks for yielding.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Chairman. On behalf of the majority, I'd like to echo the comments of my good friend, the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Dix. Chris Toffick came to the Interior Subcommittee on Appropriations a detailee from the Forest Service in the mid-1990s, and since that time has worked on a nonpartisan basis to address many of the most critical issues facing our land management agencies. Chris is one of the most professional and widely respected individuals on the Appropriation Committee staff. His dry wit and friendly disposition will be greatly missed, and his institutional knowledge of Forest Service issues will be impossible to replace. Chris, we appreciate your dedication and commitment over your many years of public service and wish you all the best in your future endeavors. I thank the gentleman.
Thank you. How much time do I have remaining?
It's remaining. Gentleman from Washington reserves.
Reserves. Does the gentleman have further speakers?
I do.
Yeah.
Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
May I inquire the time remaining on our side?
Gentleman from Kentucky has 7½ minutes remaining.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to a very hard-working member of our committee, gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Bonner.
Gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
I thank the chairman, and I urge my colleagues to support this continuing resolution. As unpleasant as it is, our Democrat colleagues, our Republican colleagues, we agree. We don't like being in the situation that we're in, but we're in this situation nevertheless. Our colleagues remember that for the first time since 1974, we didn't pass a budget last year. We didn't pass a single appropriation bill, as the chairman of the committee has noted. We don't like being in this situation, but we're in this situation. And yet, I think there's a real disconnect between Washington and the American people. I was listening to the television news this Sunday when Senator Kyl put the budget debate in perspective. And while rarely do House members quote senators, I think it's worth, we talk about trillions and billions and millions, but if you had a $10,000 budget, which most Americans can more easily identify with, and 40% of that is actually borrowed money, that what we're talking about with H.R. 1, which is the basis upon which this CR is going forward, would be shaving off $28 from a $10,000 budget. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, the reason that Congress has continued to draw such unpopular respect with the American people is that there is a disconnect. Last year, we had a $223 billion deficit, the largest in the history. And we're talking about shaving $6 billion until we can get a resolution between the House and the Senate and encourage the White House to join the mix. I thank the chairman for allowing me to speak out and encourage our colleagues to support this CR.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Washington.
I yield 1 minute to the distinguished leader of the Democratic Party in the House, Nancy Pelosi of California.
Minority Leader is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I thank him for his hard work to help keep the government open. While many of us will not agree on the legislation before us today, we know it is necessary for us to proceed. So I don't rise to support or oppose the legislation, but instead to comment on the situation that we are in. Again, today we are in a situation where we're debating a short-term bill to keep the government open on a week-by-week basis. This is not any way to run a government or a business. It certainly is not a way, as the military generals have leadership has told us, to protect the national security of our country on a week-to-week basis. Democrats will work with Republicans on legislation that will create jobs, that will strengthen the middle class, and that will reduce the deficit. But in all three of these scores, this Republican spending bill fails. Democrats have long fought on the subject of fiscal responsibility. Democrats have long fought for fiscal responsibility as a top priority of this Congress. We won't go into the history right now, but it's well known that President Clinton took us out of a period of deficit into his last 5 budgets being in surplus or in balance. President Bush turned that around immediately when he became president, and now we have to dig ourselves out of the deficit that he has taken us into. Last December, Democrats passed a $41 billion cut in the president's budget. We did so with only 1 Republican vote. $41 billion. Democrats in the lead on fiscal soundness. On the subject of jobs,
It's been 11 weeks. We're in the 11th week of the Republican majority in the Congress, and we have not seen one bill that will create jobs. In fact, the only bill coming from the Republicans, the only legislation that has come to the floor to create jobs would be the Democratic initiatives, one, to build America bonds, to build the infrastructure of America, to keep it ahead of the game in terms of innovation. Build America bonds. Republicans overwhelmingly rejected that. The other bill was a bill to keep our jobs from going overseas by rewarding businesses that sent jobs overseas. Democrats said no to that idea. Republicans said no to our legislation. 0 jobs bills in 11 weeks. Quite different from the record of President Obama coming into office 2 years ago with a Democratic Congress. President Obama was a job creator from day one. 1 week and 1 day after the President's inaugural address calling for swift, bold action now to create jobs, the House of Representatives passed the recovery bill, which was then passed by the Senate and signed into law in a matter of weeks. That legislation created or saved 3.6 million jobs. This is important in terms of the deficit because it produced jobs, produced revenue into the Treasury that helped reduce the deficit. Tax cuts for the wealthy, as has been the job creator that the Republicans have put forth in the Bush administration and since, do not create jobs and increase the deficit. And so we are at a place where we have, again, 11 weeks. The Republican, not by my measure, just looked at some of the Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke said the Republican spending bill would cost not a trivial amount of jobs. Mark Zandi, the Republican economist, said the Republican spending bill would destroy 700,000 jobs. Goldman Sachs said the Republican spending bill would reduce U.S. economic growth by 1.5% to 2%. 320 economists sent a letter calling Republican cuts a threat to our economy's long-term economic competitiveness and strength, and the strength of our current economic recovery. They all agree, to one extent or another, that the Republican agenda is taking us in the wrong direction, and that agenda is manifested in the continuing resolution, H.R. 1, and the budget approach that they are taking. In fact, in addition to not creating jobs, the Republican initiative is making matter worse. Many of us have come to the floor to talk about budgets year in and year out, and we all say that our national budget should be a statement of our national values. What is important to our country should be reflected in the allocation of our resources. We want to have that debate on values rather than just on cuts. Again, we all agree we have to get rid of waste, fraud, abuse, duplication, obsolescence, and the rest. The GAO has given us a blueprint for that, and we subscribe to that. We all agree that we must reduce the deficit, and the Fiscal Commission has given us a roadmap for that. We can agree or disagree with some of it, but the fact is it gives us a blueprint for how to go forward, and we should take heed of that. And that blueprint says that we should not be making cuts right now that will be harmful to our recovery. And yet that's exactly what the Republican initiatives do. So this statement of value, when we have this debate, it's not a debate about are we going to cut off 6 million or 3 million seniors off of Meals on Wheels. It's about who we are as a country. How do we protect the American people, both in our national security and our neighborhoods? How we educate our children to make them happy, but also to keep us competitive as innovators internationally. How we maintain a healthy America, not just about their health care, but about their good health, the air they breathe, the water they drink, the safety of the food that they eat. Again, it's about the creation of jobs. I believe we have an obligation as a government to be job creators, which give people the means to find their own happiness, but also bring revenue into the Treasury if we're just speaking pragmatically and not in terms of value. So I don't believe it's just about the dollars. It's about the values that we have to have this debate. And unfortunately, the bills that we are being presented with, H.R. 1, are like a balloon. You squeeze it here, pops out there. It doesn't change anything for the better. In fact, as has been indicated, it makes matters worse. So again, as we consider our budgetary decisions as a discussion of a statement of our national values, we have to remember that the greatness of our country depends on the strengthening of our middle class, and that we have to do that by creating jobs, and we certainly must reduce the deficit. Now we are waiting at the negotiating table for the Republicans to show that they are willing to work together. We've cut the $41 billion with one Republican vote, that they are willing to work together to reach an agreement that is a statement of our values. I think we can do that. Many of us have worked together on the Appropriations Committee over the years. I urge our Republican colleagues to join us in our efforts to create jobs, to strengthen the middle class, and to reduce the deficit, and to do so in the interest of the American people. And that's why I think this vote today, people will vote however they view their own statement about it. But the big vote that is coming up is the vote on the continuing resolution on the long-term basis to keep government open and functioning for people, again, in a way that is a statement of values for our great country. With that, I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Kentucky.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to a new member of our committee, a hard-working member, Mr. Womack from the state of Arkansas.
Gentleman from Arkansas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the gentleman from Kentucky for your leadership on the Appropriations Committee and for yielding me some time here this morning. Yes, it's true. I came here on January the 5th, and just a few weeks ago I put my hand up and took the oath of office. And as I did, I'm reminded of the fact that at that precise time in my life, I was taking the oath of office already 3 months into the fiscal year. Now, you show me what business, what governmental jurisdiction anywhere in America is effectively and efficiently managed when you're operating without a budget already 3 months into the budget year. Look, I was a mayor of a very dynamic city in northwest Arkansas. We never did that. We couldn't survive by passing our budget sometime during the course of the ongoing year. So our conference, in particular, is leading by example, and we are providing a leadership example for spending cuts that so many people around America have said over and over again that we have to achieve. Look, America gets it. We're $1.5 trillion in deficit in this FY, and we're $14+ trillion in debt. We have to do something about spending. And look, it's all about the end game. And this is where this side of the aisle and that side of the aisle can come to agreement, that we know that the end game is about the creation of jobs. The ideological difference about how we get there, I think, is what divides us. But I'm a firm believer. Any businessman will tell you, any mayor, any county judge, any governmental official will tell you that your balance sheet drives a lot of things. I think fundamental to that balance sheet is how much you're in debt, because how much you are in debt in business is tied to your assets. In government, it's tied to your capacity to tax. And right now, one of the fundamental problems about growing jobs in this economy is the uncertainty that hangs over the job creators in America. Unnecessary and overburdensome regulation. Would the gentleman yield another 30 seconds? Possibly. Let me just finish by saying that I urge support of H.J.R. 48 and yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Kentucky has 3.5 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Washington has 4 minutes remaining. Gentleman from Washington.
How many speakers does the gentleman have? 2? Why don't you go ahead and with your speaker, and then you finish.
Gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Hurt.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the chairman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, today I rise in support of this temporary continuing resolution and urge my colleagues to do the same. As we debate this measure, let's remember why we are here. Let's remember that on November 2nd, the people of Virginia's 5th District and the people across this country sent a message to Washington, a message to Republicans and to Democrats. The message was urgent, it was clear, and it was loud. The message sent was that now is the time to stop the government spending, stop the government borrowing, and stop the raid on our children's future. So what have we found since we got here? We find that our President and the last Congress, despite enjoying great majorities in each chamber, completely and totally failed nearly 6 months ago to live up to its most fundamental responsibility to adopt a budget for fiscal year 2011. Because of their failure to lead, the American people still, 6 months later, do not have a budget. After the House worked into the early morning hours nearly a month ago and sent H.R. 1 down the hall to the opposite chamber, what has the Senate done? They left town, and they failed to adopt any proposal to fund the government for the rest of the fiscal year. And what has the President done? While continuing to fail to lead on the 2011 budget, he has now proposed a budget for fiscal year 2012 that does not decrease spending and borrowing, but instead increases government spending and nearly doubles government borrowing in the next 10 years. After it's all said and done, the Senate and the White House have not heard the message from the people in the last election and are continuing to fail to lead. Now is the time for this Congress to listen. Now is the time for this Congress to act. I believe that the majority in this House is listening, and this temporary continuing resolution gets us one step closer to fulfilling the purpose given us by the American people. Cut government spending and reduce government borrowing for the sake of future generations. Simply put, by voting in favor of this measure today, we are putting a $6 billion deposit on the account for our children and our grandchildren who for far too long have been forgotten here in Washington. I thank the chairman and yield back my time.
Gentleman's time's expired. Gentleman from Washington.
I yield myself the remaining time.
The gentleman's recognized for 4 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I rise to review the bidding here. We are down to the end of this debate on this continuing resolution, and I hope, and as I know Chairman Rogers hopes, that this will be the last continuing resolution and that working together we can come together on a solution to the FY11 budget. Now, I've heard and repeatedly, and I even mentioned this in my last statement, and the next thing I knew it was on Cantor's website. But back in 2007, the distinguished gentleman from Kentucky will remember that when we took over power and won the election in 2006, most of the 9, I think, or 10 of the appropriation bills were not enacted, and the Democrats had to pass a bill in February enacting all of these things. So maybe we learned that lesson from you all over there. And I hope you'll remember it, because you seem to like this has never happened before. Well, that's number one. Number two, the American people in a Washington Post ABC poll yesterday, over the weekend, said that they are worried that the cuts in H.R. 1 will hurt the economy. It was narrow. It was 45-41. But 71% of the people said the problem was that your side isn't engaging, and that they blame the Republicans for not getting this deal. Now, why would they think that? I think the reason for it is when the first Rogers Amendment proposal came out, that was a kind of a reasonable approach, but that was rejected, and then they doubled the amount of these cuts, and the cuts became very severe and very questionable. There was a story in the Washington Post today that lays out if you cut food inspectors, you're going to pay for it. If you cut WIC funding, you're going to pay for it, billions in these children. And so I just point these things out. Cutting Head Start, this was perceived by the American people as too extreme. And that is why you can't get anybody. The Senate rejected H.R. 1. The President's rejected H.R. 1. We need to have reasonable people sit down and work out a compromise and not let the government be shut down. And I believe that this should be the last CR, and that we all should agree here today that this is going to be the last CR, and that we are committed to getting this resolved. And that's what the American people also said in this ABC Washington Post polls. Not that I follow the polls much, but they also said they wanted us to come to an agreement. So again, I am pledged to our chairman that we're not going to let this happen again. That this year we will pass all 12 appropriation bills by August, and we've done that before, and we'll end this process that started back in 2007 and which got continued in 2011. It's not the way to do the government's business. So let's make a pledge today that we're going to, after this CR, that we're going to work together to solve this problem and move on to FY12. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Washington yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Kentucky.
Madam Speaker, I yield the balance of our time to a hard-working member of our committee, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. LaTourette.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
I thank the chair and I thank the chairman for yielding. You know, I listened with great interest to the distinguished minority leader and her remarks, and I always like listening to her. I never cast my ballot for her to become the Speaker of the House in the last 2 Congresses, but as an American, we all celebrated the historic accomplishment that she became the first woman to preside over this chamber since the founding of the Republic. And a lot of wonderful things will be said and written about her tenure as Speaker of the House. One thing that will not be said or written is that she presided over 2 Congresses that will be known for fiscal responsibility. That Congress passed a bank bailout bill costing $700 billion, which may bankrupt the nation. Passed an $800 billion stimulus bill that created no jobs that may bankrupt the nation. Passed a cap and tax piece of legislation that would gut jobs in Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana and would have bankrupted the nation. And finally, a health care bill that took over 1/6 of the nation's economy, did not bend the cost curve, and if not checked, will in fact bankrupt the nation. The distinguished minority leader's speech reminds me of that old adage that everybody wants to go to heaven but nobody wants to die. We hear continuously, we have to cut, we have to cut, we have to cut, but not these cuts, not those cuts, not this program, not my program. The time is now. The time is serious. We have laid an offer upon the table, and we wait with great expectation. Now I know what all those people in St. Peter's Square must feel like when they're waiting for the white smoke to come out of the top of the dome for the election of a pope. We would like very much for the other side of this Capitol to give us a proposal to negotiate with. We would like very much for the Vice President of the United States to return to this nation to talk to us. It's not happening. We need to pass the bill.
All time for debate has expired.
He's back.
All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 167, the joint resolution is considered read, and the previous question is ordered. The question is on the engrossment and the 3rd reading of the joint resolution. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. 3rd reading.
Joint resolution making further continuing appropriations for fiscal year 2011 and for other purposes.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I have a motion to recommit at the desk.
Is the gentleman opposed to the joint resolution?
Yes, I am.
Gentleman qualifies. The clerk will report the motion.
Mr. Kretz of Pennsylvania moves to recommit the joint resolution, House Joint Resolution 48, to the Committee on Appropriations with instructions to report the same back to the House forthwith with the following amendment. Page 20, line 2, strike the final period and the preceding quotation marks. Page 20, after line 2, insert the following. Section 295, none of the funds made available by this Act may be used to develop or implement a system that cuts Social Security benefits or that privatizes Social Security. Section 296, none of the funds made available by this Act may be used to develop or implement a system that cuts Medicare benefits, eliminates guaranteed health coverage for seniors, or establishes a Medicare voucher plan that limits payments to beneficiaries in order to purchase health care in the private sector.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his motion.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As I listened to the debate on the current CR and where this debate has been taking us throughout this year, I have some reasons for alarm, and I think the best way to start it off is to at least start to let you know a little bit about myself. Is that for most of my life I worked in the private sector. I've worked all my life and paid into Social Security, and the folks that I live with and live around and the people of my district have come to rely on Social Security and what it provides for actually generations at this point. And as I have been sitting here listening to this current CR, which I'm opposed to, you know, I think that we're all 435 of us are sent here to lead. And unfortunately, what we've heard time and time again is finger-pointing as it's your fault, it's our fault, it's their fault, instead of us sitting down and talking to one another and figuring out where we can compromise and how we can come to a final solution to what our problems are. And it's really very disheartening. And I can understand the folks who watch this at home are trying to figure out, well, whose side are we on? Are we on their side, or are we on our particular party side or our particular stance's side? And I think it's very unfortunate, because at the end of the day, we all have very strong opinions on what the best way forward is in this country. And unfortunately, it's about compromise, because even though we all have strong opinions, we all have differing opinions. And if we don't work it out, we're not going to get anywhere. So as I stand in opposition to this CR, it's something that is disheartening. Now, I'm on the Armed Services Committee and have been hearing from industry time and time again at how difficult it is for them in the long term. So as we talk about cutting, we're going to cut $2 billion a week for these next 3 weeks. Well, by doing these short-term CRs, we're actually costing our country money. And no one talks about that, about what the impact is going to be from this temporary solution. And the Republicans have talked about, well, the Democrats didn't complete their work last year. That's true. But now the Republicans are in charge, and you're in charge. You were given a charge to lead this country, and here we are going around again doing a 2-week, a 3-week. This isn't leading. This is playing games, and it's time to stand up and do the right thing for this country. But my MTR, motion to recommit, involves Social Security, because the debate that's been happening has been trying to frame Social Security as a problem and the reason for the deficits that this country is experiencing. And I brought a chart with me, and I want to read to you the net increase in assets in the Social Security Trust Fund for the last 6 years. In 2005, the Social Security Trust Fund increased $172 billion. In 2006, it increased by $189.5 billion. These are increases. This means that the money that comes into Social Security via your taxes and interest is more than what's going out paying in benefits. So when people start talking about, well, Social Security is causing our deficit problem and we have to address entitlement programs, they're not giving you the whole picture. They're trying to tell you that, well, down the road, we may have an issue. Well, no. Right now, in 2007, the Social Security Trust Fund increased $190.4 billion. In 2008, increased $180 billion. In 2009, it increased $122 billion. So the trust fund's going up, and it actually has $2.6 trillion in it right now. So the people that are receiving Social Security now shouldn't be worried about what it's doing to the deficit, because that increase in the trust fund is actually money that's coming into the government in excess of what Social Security is spending. But I brought up a chart here because I want to show people that when you start talking about Social Security, now if you look at the 12th District of Pennsylvania, I have an elderly population. I'm one of the districts that has a lot of senior citizens in it, and a lot of people on Social Security. And if you look at this chart, 77% of people say, leave Social Security alone. Don't touch the retirement age, don't touch the benefits. They say, come to a solution, figure out a way to move forward. And there are compromises that can be had to help solve the Social Security issue, because we do have an issue long term. Baby boomers are retiring. less people are paying in. So there is some issues that we have to address. But don't buy into this crisis legislation that if we don't do something immediately, that Social Security is going to be in trouble. You're hearing all kinds of scenarios, and the one that scares me the most, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, thank you, and I urge support of this amendment. It does not recommit the bill. It's an amendment and would just be added to the bill. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Kentucky. For what purpose does he rise?
Madam Speaker, I rise in opposition to the motion.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, this provision doesn't do anything. Nothing in the CR would cut Social Security or Medicare benefits, nor would it privatize Social Security. We're totally committed in this bill to saving Social Security. So this, let me be honest, this is a procedural motion that's simply a fog screen trying to hide us from our real task at hand, but I don't think we'll be fooled by that. The debate should not be about procedure or fog screens or things unrelated to the bill. It should be about doing our job. We are here this afternoon to provide the necessary resources to keep the government's doors open while we lock in important budget savings totaling $6 billion. That's $2 billion in spending reductions or savings to the taxpayer, $2 billion a week. The path this body set with passage of H.R. 1 a couple of weeks ago. I'd also like to remind my colleagues that with the passage of this CR today, we will have cut over $10 billion in the span of 2 weeks. That sets a record. That's never been done before in this body. The closest was 1995 at $9 billion. This is more than double the $4.7 billion that Senator Reid and the Senate Democrats proposed in their CR last week to fund the government for the remaining 6 months. We do in 2 weeks what they would take 6 months to do. The American people sent us here with a clear message last November. They want us to end the partisan bickering and get our work done. Instead of picking political fights, they want us united in cutting the budget. This motion moves us further away from that goal. It would send us backwards, not forwards. It's a smokescreen, a procedural motion. Let's get on with it. Vote no, and then vote yes on final. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Without objection, the previous question is ordered on the motion to recommit. The question is on the motion. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed, say no. The noes have it. The noes have it. The motion is not agreed to.
Madam Speaker,
Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
I request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and the nays will rise. A sufficient number having arisen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 8 and Clause 9 of Rule 20, this 15-minute vote on the motion to recommit will be followed by 5-minute votes on passage of H.J. Resolution 48, if ordered, and adoption of H.Con. Res. 30 by the yeas and the nays. This will be a 15-minute vote.
Series of 3 votes here. This first one on the Democrat and the underlying bill today, the debate that's just wrapped up on the 6th temporary federal spending bill for fiscal year 2011. This would fund the federal government beyond March 18th through April the 8th, cuts about $6 billion from current levels. So this first vote, 15 minutes, and during this first portion of the vote, we're going to get some background on the federal spending debate from a Capitol Hill reporter. Nancy Ignanovich of BNA News, could this be the last short-term spending bill?
I really think it could be, because there's growing unrest among some House Republicans for a series of stopgap bills, even though in a lot of ways they're getting what they want. They're getting more cuts as they go, but I think some fear that they're losing the momentum for the big budget-cutting bill that they want, and they want to draw a line in the sand and get the thing over with.
Well, what else is underlying some of that unrest that members have?
They're not getting the policy riders on these short-term bills that they had in H.R. 1, which they passed before the last recess with a good, strong vote, and maybe they feel they're losing momentum for that. The short-term bills don't have the policy riders that they want for, among other things, to defund President Obama's health care reform bill.
Well, let's talk about the longer-term bill. The negotiations continue behind the scenes. Any idea how those are going?
Actually, we haven't heard much about the negotiations on the long-term bill. After last week, when we didn't hear about any talks, we thought that they'd be starting up again this week because Vice President Biden, who the President detailed to oversee those talks, has returned from an overseas trip, but we haven't heard about the principals getting together again. And in the meantime, having to work to get the votes to pass the short-term bills seems to take some energy away, so that maybe leaders don't have as much time to work on the longer-term bill to fund the government through September 30th.
What about the congressional Democrats? Where do they stand on approving another CR, this one cutting another $2 billion per week?
Well, essentially, they are on board, and one of the reasons why is because the cuts that are in the current CR were cuts that the President himself proposed in his budget. And last week, before this bill was unveiled by House Appropriations Committee Chairman Hal Rogers, it had been negotiated with Democrats, including Senate Democrats, and they're on board. So I don't think the opposition is coming from Democrats so much as from some Republicans.
Well, assuming the House passes the bill today, what's the prospect in the Senate?
Some Republicans in the Senate have said they won't vote for it, including freshman Senator Rubio and now today Senator Jim DeMint. But the minority leader, Mitch McConnell, said yesterday that he's confident this will pass, and he says it should pass. It has his support. It will buy time to get the longer-term bill done, and in the process it also includes cuts that House Republicans favor, and Senate Republicans also. So even though he said it might be a difficult week and not everyone is happy, he said by week's end he believes it will pass.
Well, on the Senate side, will Senator McCain get his amendment approved that would propose providing full-year funding for the Defense Department?
I think it's unlikely. It would really change the dynamics of everything because basically it would fund the Pentagon for the rest of the year and provide all the funding needed for the wars overseas. And that's right there, you know, over $500 billion. And that's a large part of the negotiation on the bill to fund the government through next fall. And if you take defense funding off the table, then it's harder to cut defense as part of this negotiation.
Nancy Ognatovich of BNA News with an update on 2011 federal spending. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks a lot.
And final passage on that temporary spending bill, the final passage vote coming up after this. Hear the motion to recommit vote. Congressman Mark Kritz of Pennsylvania offering the motion, which seeks to prohibit the use of funds in the continuing resolution to develop or implement a system of Social Security benefits that cuts Social Security benefits. 15-minute vote on the House floor. Earlier today, House Republican leadership held a news conference. They unveiled a study today that on reducing federal spending and its impact on the economy. You'll hear from the Majority Leader Eric Cantor and also the Joint Economic Committee Vice Chairman Kevin Brady in this news conference, and we'll show you as much as we can as this vote continues.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. We're here today because of the great work of the Joint Economic Committee, whose Vice Chairman, Kevin Brady, has once again done a terrific job at encapsulating what the work we're about means. And as you know, we Republicans started in our majority saying that our majority will be about jobs and the economy. But we had some tough things to do in order to demonstrate results. And what we said first is we have got to reduce the growth of government and bring our fiscal house into order in order for the private sector to grow. And that's exactly what Kevin's report that he'll talk about says. less government spending means more private sector jobs, period. And as you know, Kevin Brady was the author, if you will, of the chart, the famous, now famous chart of Obamacare. And it was his work in the Joint Economic Committee that produced that, that's so stuck in the minds of so many Americans about the complexity and really the monstrosity of the Obamacare bill. So with that, I want to turn it over to the Majority Whip, Kevin McCarthy.
Thank you. I'm the other Kevin. But I will tell you, the work that Kevin Brady and the committee has just done is the right time and the right facts. He studied 4 decades, 107 countries, 26 of them lower their deficit. And what happens? You don't wait 4 decades to get the job growth. It comes right away. So America is at a crossroads. There's different ways to go about doing it. But this study also shows if you raise taxes, it's not a way to end a crisis. If you cut government debt, the private sector grows. Jobs grow. So I want you to take one moment, and I want you to imagine. Imagine the potential for all Americans if they were freed of the burden of the debt that we have before us. Now, that's the path we're on. So, as Republicans stated out in their pledge, they're here to grow jobs and cut government spending. And Kevin Brady and Joint Economics have just found out by the facts to everybody else that that is actually what works, proven, and that's the path we're on. I can't thank Kevin enough for the work they've done.
I serve in the Ways and Means Committee on the Select Revenue Subcommittee, and you can imagine there's 2 basic pathways to try to close a budget gap. One is to raise taxes, and the other is to cut spending. What the Joint Economic Commission has demonstrated is a global perspective and a historical perspective that sets out a pathway that's straightforward. It's not easy, but it's clear. And if the American public joins with us, House Republicans, and we're reflecting their values in this debate, what we're doing is creating a pathway for prosperity. And there's an urgency to this, not just in the short term, but ultimately in the long term. And with that, I'd like to yield to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Brady.
Peter, thank you to Leader Cantor and Whip McCarthy. Thank you for being here today. Let me give some brief remarks and walk you through this new study today. For the past 2 years, the American people have been told the only way for a path forward to economic recovery was more federal spending that drove up federal debt. And the White House and Washington Democrats, unfortunately, continue to cling to this failed economic model, refusing to listen to voices of respected mainstream economists here in the United States. The job gap between their promises and the results is significant and disappointing. After throwing nearly $5 trillion in fiscal and monetary stimulus at the economy, there are actually 2 million fewer jobs today than when the stimulus began. The White House promised our unemployment rate would be down to 6.9% by now. And as for total jobs in America today, the White House fell short of their promises by 7 million American workers. The government spending is the answer crowd had their chance to jumpstart the economy. They failed. It's time for a proven approach. Republicans in Congress are determined to remove barriers to new jobs by tackling America's dangerous deficits and removing the resulting uncertainty that deters business from hiring new workers. There's nearly $2 trillion of capital sidelined in America. Republicans are determined to bring that capital back to the economy to create jobs as a result. Let me run through a couple charts here, if I may. This chart, we tracked the last 40 years in America, our economy and spending. This first chart shows private sector jobs increases, the jobs along Main Street, and federal government or business investment. What it shows is a direct correlation. When companies large and small buy new buildings, new equipment, new software, private sector jobs grow. Look at the next slide. Let's go back to. Perfect. And here you'll see the blue line, which is federal government spending the last 40 years. The red line is job creation. If you track job growth And if you track federal government spending, you'll realize there is no correlation. In fact, as federal spending grows, jobs along Main Street shrink. That's because without private investment, you don't have the jobs that go with it. There is no substitute for private business investment, not federal spending, not rebates, not even shovel-ready projects. The new report we unveiled today is entitled Spend Less, Owe Less, Grow the Economy. It surveys empirical, mainstream, peer-reviewed economic studies over the past 4 decades, examining our global competitors with high debt. It provides clear and convincing evidence that countries that reduce their government debt through spending cuts boost the economic growth and job creation in the short term. Respected economists found a number of instances from 1970 to 2007 where many of our U.S. competitors successfully reduced their debt-to-GDP ratio predominantly or entirely by savings through spending cuts. And they grew their economy at the same time. Canada, our neighboring Canada, shrank total government spending by 12 percentage points starting in 1994. They boosted their economy from an anemic less than 1% to a robust 3.4% average over the next 12 years. Sweden's economy was actually shrinking in the early 1990s. After reducing Swedish government spending by 11 percentage points of their GDP, Sweden's negative growth economy revived to an average of 3.5% annually. New Zealand did exactly the same. But they are not alone, and that's the point of this study. Economists found 26 episodes in 9 developed economies where reducing debt through spending cuts provided a large boost to economic growth in the first 3 years after this reduction began. And perhaps the most important finding is this. And while most economists agree that reducing federal spending increases economic growth in the long term, what this study found is that reducing federal spending through spending cuts boosts the economy in the short term as well. So what spurred the growth when countries reduced their debt? 2 things. Businesses no longer expected the government to levy large tax increases in the future to pay for this excessive spending, so businesses did what they do. They stepped up their investment in buildings, equipment, and software, and as we've shown before in America, private investment creates jobs. Secondly, households, no longer facing higher taxes, had higher expectations for permanent disposable income, so they became more confident, and they bought bigger ticket items because that uncertainty about higher taxes went away as well. So by removing the uncertainty for both businesses and households, countries saw higher economic growth. And to maximize, there's a point, too, in this study that I thought was fascinating. To maximize the economic boost in the short term, and to maximize the jobs you create, the report found that spending reductions must be large, credible, and difficult to reverse once made. And those are important points. Those cuts had to be credible, they had to be significant, they had to be difficult to reverse in the future. The savings that produced the greatest economic growth included right-sizing the government workforce and its compensation, eliminating duplicative agencies and programs, eliminating transfer payments, that is subsidies to businesses, and reforming and reducing transfer payments to individuals. And within this study, what became clear as well is countries that tackled entitlement reform and made these changes boosted their economy. The conclusion I'd like to make is that delaying these spending cuts are risky to the U.S. economy. President Obama and congressional Democrats have emphasized the risk of reducing now America's deficits and debt, but they ignore the risk of delay. As this mainstream study shows, ample real-life data proves there are significant economic growth and job creation benefits that come from reducing spending and reforming entitled programs to restore their sustainability for future generations. For America's economic future, it's time for a proven path forward, and to grow our economy, it's time for Washington to spend less and owe less as a nation.
Questions? We do have a vote on some. Yes.
In this study, economists identified different subsidies throughout the world. You know, the equivalent of ours would be an Amtrak subsidy, an ethanol subsidy. There are a range of them. But to my knowledge, the Republican Conference is looking at the whole range of those items. But, Leader?
Yeah, I mean, listen, this goes back to the underlying premise. You can't come to Washington, wave a magic wand, spend taxpayer dollars, and expect there to be growth. Again, Kevin's report points out that those who subscribe to that theory had their day, and clearly the results were not there. Yes, sir.
It says here, in some cases, the non-PED effects may be strong enough to make fiscal consolidation programs expansionary in the short term as well as the long term. So you're not guaranteeing job growth.
You can't. If you look at 107 countries, they are different. It didn't work in all cases. What we identified, or what the economists identified, was the winning formula, how you boost jobs by reducing your debt. In fact, they gave us a very good model to follow as we go forward as well.
Yes.
Today, Minority Reporter says that they are waiting now for a counteroffer from you. I know yesterday you said you were waiting for an offer from them. Now they say they're waiting for an offer from you. Can you respond to that?
Sure. It's just time for the games to stop. You know, I mean, we are where the American people are. We want to resolve the spending question for the remainder of this year as quickly as we can. Again, let's not forget the reason why we are here is that the majority of last Congress was unable to pass any spending bill other than hang on to current rates. I'm hopeful that we can see that this is the last stopgap measure and that we can come to some resolution to cut spending so we can begin to facilitate an environment, as the report indicates, for job growth. Yes.
He made the point that he was concerned Republicans are focusing too much on discretionary spending, particularly non-defense. And he said it actually distracts from the larger challenge of getting entitlements under control and also overhauling debt.
First of all, let's say this. If we can't cut some discretionary spending, how do we expect to go about the even more difficult issues of the mandatory spending and the entitlement spending? And so what we're doing here is we're actually delivering on the promise that we made. We're going to change the culture in Washington. You know, can you imagine what the discussion was a year ago? We're actually discussing how much to cut now. So again, it is taking us, you know, a deliberate plan and effort to go about cutting spending, you know, everywhere in this town. We all know the facts. We're borrowing nearly 40 cents out of every dollar that is being spent. That is unsustainable. Families can't do that. Businesses can't do that. The government can't do that. So again, I would say that, yes, we're going to deal with all of it. We've said when our budget comes forward out of the Budget Committee and Chairman Ryan within the next month, you're going to see where Republicans stand, and it's going to be to reform entitlements. You know, our bottom line is we're going to protect today's seniors and those nearing retirement. But for the rest of us, 54 and under, we're going to come to grips with the fact that if we want those programs to be around, they're going to look a lot different. Yes, sir.
Are you able to make any projections about job growth and spending?
Well, again, I think that is the trap that the administration and the Democrats fell into last Congress, to ensure that that they would demonstrate their government spending would produce X number of jobs. We don't believe that you necessarily can wave a magic wand in Washington and create jobs. What the study indicates, that the trends say, is if governments get their fiscal house in order, there is a much better environment for growth and job creation.
You do know that the Keynesian view of the stimulus didn't work, and it cost us $1 trillion.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
House Republican leaders from earlier today. On the House floor now, a vote on a motion to recommit offered by Democrat Mark Kritz of Pennsylvania. It's a 15-minute vote. Winding down, the next vote is the final passage vote on the temporary spending bill, the sixth such measure for fiscal year 2011. funding the government and government programs, cutting $6 billion through April the 8th. The current continuing resolution runs out this Friday, Friday the 18th. David Hawkins of Congressional Quarterly writes that many more members of both parties will vote against today's CR than oppose the current stopgap spending measure, which passed the House 2 weeks ago. He writes that even if today's vote is in the seemingly lopsided 250 to 175 range on final passage, it would signal that patience is running thin in both parties, and that in order to avoid a stalemate and then a shutdown, the deal to close out fiscal year 2011 and raise the curtain on a new budget year in October will need to happen before the scheduled start of the 2-week congressional spring recess 1 month from today. That's David Hawkins writing in Congressional Quarterly about the vote that's coming up on the continuing resolution. President Obama today, the Associated Press is just reporting this, the President will be making an unscheduled stop today at Arlington National Cemetery to honor the last American World War I veteran. He and the Vice President, Joe Biden, will be paying respects for Frank Buckles, who's been lying in honor at Arlington National Cemetery. The funeral services and burial later today at Arlington National. And you too can watch that as well online at our companion network, cspan.org.
On this vote, the ayes are 190 and the nays are 239, and the motion is not adopted. The question is on passage of the bill, and those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Recorded.